Up next on Book TV's Afterwards, New York Magazine's Rebecca Traister traces the history of female anger and how it's fueled political movements. She's interviewed by Brittney Cooper, Rutgers University Women's and Gender Studies professor and author of Eloquent Rage. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Thank you for being with us, Rebecca.
Thank you. I couldn't be happier to be talking to anybody but you, Brittney.
I know. Look, let's get good and mad. Because there's just so much to be upset about. And the first thing I want to ask is about how we get here. How did we get to this moment? Because one of the things that you outline so well in your book is that fury is not new. Women's fury has driven politics from as far back as we can remember when we think about the Republic and the history of the Republic, and yet we seem to have to keep rediscovering it.
Yeah.
How did we get to that?
Well, I think part of the propulsive power of anger is the way that it gets covered up, right? So it's in the squashing of it after it's been released that you have a buildup of the energy and the frustration that when the next time comes around, it sort of explodes out of you. And it's one of the reasons I think that the anger of subjugated or oppressed people can be so explosive, because fundamental to their subjugation and oppression is a squashing of their ability to voice dissent. And that's one of the hallmarks. It's one of the things I try to trace in the book, the discouragement toward expressions of anger from people who don't have power, especially if their anger is about the ways in which they are disempowered. Then that anger is heard as irrational, unserious, infantile, unhinged, crazy, hysterical. And so it's discouraged. And there's a sense that many of us absorb that we're not supposed to be angry if we want to say something out of anger, even if that anger, especially if that anger is valid, righteous, based in fact, that it will be heard as irrational and therefore undermine the very thing the very point we want to make, and so we don't express it. And I think that there are periods, this is speaking very broadly because we're talking about periods that extend decades,
That's right.
in which cultural messages work to suppress that anger. There are always people popping up who are angry. And in fact, we need to pay attention to them because they're doing it in periods where it's really hard because there's so much cultural and popular pressure to not give voice to that fury.
That's right.
But then there are moments where there's a kind of mass experience of, I can't hold it in anymore.
Right.
And then it pops, like you take a cork out of it.
That's right.
And it's all that pent up fury, and that's how you get the start of some of the social movements that I think have transformed the country.
But you're sort of challenging us, right, to not wait for it to get so pent up, but to kind of live in the space of anger, right?
Well, to live in the space of anger, but if there's anything in the book that's sort of directive rather than, or prescriptive,
Sure.
It's not so much, and the book is more descriptive about the circumstances, the history, the context, the reasons for anger. But if there is a prescriptive thing in the book, like what do you do, right? It is less about, do we individually rage? Because part of what this book seeks to identify is the fact that there are punishments when we do rage,
That's
if
right.
we are marginalized in
That's
some
right.
way, right? There are ways in which we pay for it if we're angry. So the prescription is we need to change the way that anger is received. So it's less about rage all the time, and it's more about listen for when we're in these, for the ways in which the rage is suppressed, and try to undo it. Try to be curious about the anger of other women.
Yes.
Be curious about the anger of people whose anger you're told doesn't count.
Right.
Question those messages.
So I want to talk about that, but I want to drill in just a little bit around that. One of the things that I found so useful is that you also give us a little bit of your own journey to recognizing how mad you are at particular moments. And so I see all kinds of things happening. There's curiosity about your own anger. There's also skepticism about it. There's a little bit of resistance to it. And finally, there's this embrace. So can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah. It was a curiosity about my own anger. And again, the book is not about, it's not about me, but it obviously is, I write a little bit about this.
Sure.
I'm a feminist journalist. Part of my work, as long as I've been doing it, has obviously been rooted in anger. You wouldn't be a journalist writing about inequity,
Right.
about gender inequity, racial inequity, economic inequality, if you weren't mad about those inequities. From this perspective, you wouldn't be doing that. So obviously there's been anger undergirding my work for a long time.
Yeah.
But when I decided I was going to write this book on anger, and I thought about how it has played into my work, one of the things I could do when I look back was see the pains that I had taken early in my career to obscure that anger. Because I had absorbed the notion that if I was too angry, I wouldn't be heard clearly. I wouldn't be taken seriously. I'd sound hysterical. I'd sound radical. And it's funny, even some of the most anodyne sort of baby feminist writing that I did 15 years ago, it was not very good, right? It's like the most like mild pop feminism. What was you, when I think about the comments that I got back then,
Yeah.
a lot of them were rooted in, you sound like a crazy, sex-starved woman who's just mad because men don't like you. I mean, it was already, when I was sort of writing like pop commentary about Paris Hilton,
Yes.
like what the response automatically was, you're too angry for me to take you seriously. Even when I was covering up that anger with jokes and sort of slyness and a general good cheer. Now, I didn't think about it at the time. Or maybe I did, because the calculations we make are so daily about like, oh, that's going to sound too extreme, like I got to ratchet that back.
Yeah.
So when I got to the point of writing this book, there was a moment of real revelation. And this is after my writing has gotten angrier and angrier, and or at least I've been able to be more open about it. There was a moment several summers ago, I think in 2015, I was writing my regular column, and I was livid about a series of things. It was actually 2014. I was livid about a series of Supreme Court decisions,
Yes.
about a number of stories I'd been reading about the assaults and treatment of young women of color whose assaults had been broadcast through the world on the internet. I was so mad. And I just let myself write out of fury, and I didn't temper it, and I didn't try to disguise it. Yeah. And I found that column happened to go over really well. And that was my first experience of thinking consciously, wow, anger can be a communicative tool. It can resonate for people. Yeah. That was an important step. Yeah. But it's not like after that I was like, oh, every column is going to be rage-filled, right? Sure. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
But when I finally decided to write this book that was going to look at rage, like look at the stuff I write about politics, mass movements of resistance, inequality, and look specifically at rage, I realized how much of the degree to which I've experienced frustration has come from the feeling the need to bottle up my rage, to disguise it, the knowledge that it would not work for me tactically or rhetorically to express it. And that was sort of a fascinating moment. Again, it was like I just looked back and everything sort of became clear, and I was like, oh, I see the through line here. I see where my anger's been, and where I have worked to cover it up and make it look like something more palatable.
Yeah. As I was reading, I was thinking about so many of the women you outline. You say this thing about how there's a cost for anger. You talk about Patty Murray and Pauli Murray and Shirley Chisholm. And I thought about Ida B. Wells. The very first time that she gave an anti-lynching speech in 1892, she cried. And she was mortified that she cried. And you talked about how Shirley Chisholm would leave and then cry in private. And I wonder about the kind of, it feels to me that so much of what is at the heart of rage for powerful women, I'm thinking too about Hillary Clinton, is that you are angry but you can't express it, and that sometimes you're afraid to express it because you know that it can just devolve into tears really quickly.
Yes.
Right?
And the tears come from that inexpressibility.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you bring up Hillary Clinton, and one of the things I thought about only in retrospect is I wrote my first book about Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, and Sarah Palin, and the gender, racial, and class politics of the 2008 election, in which they were all historic figures playing these unprecedented roles.
That's right.
And a very memorable moment for Hillary Clinton in 2008 is when she cries in New Hampshire.
That's right.
And in that book, which I wrote many years ago, long before I got anywhere near to where my thinking is now on this subject, my theory, the press all said, oh, she cried and that's why she won. She cried, and then the next night she staged a surprise primary victory in New Hampshire over Barack Obama because of women's votes. Yeah. And all of the mainstream press covered it as it being about the vulnerability of crying. Yeah. Right? That she had, in shedding tears, women had flocked to her in a kind of soggy sisterhood. Yes, we just love other ladies who cry, right? That was the story.
Yes.
Now, back almost 9 years ago when I wrote that book, I had a different theory, which was that her crying that whole weekend that she'd been in New Hampshire, predicted to lose, the press had been dancing on her grave and saying she's going to lose, everybody said she was inevitable, but she's going to lose, she's going to be out of the primary, and that she'd actually gotten mad. And she'd talked back to Chris Matthews, she'd yelled at these guys who'd held up an iron my shirt sign, she'd said, oh, the remnants of sexism. It's the first time she even acknowledged sexism, and then she'd gotten sort of misty. She didn't really cry, by the way, she just got kind of congested.
That's right.
And that the women who went out and voted for her, I posited then, were voting for her not because they were like, oh, we love a lady who cries, but because they recognized in her frustration something they were mad about, which was this woman being written off, whether or not they loved her or what, that they were mad, and that's what powered their votes. But I didn't think the press saw that, because one of the reasons tears are so misunderstood is they're read automatically as a sign of vulnerability.
That's right.
And this is, of course, especially true if you are a white woman whose vulnerability and ability to conform to traditionally white patriarchal ideas of what femininity is can resonate. But for those white women, and of course for some women of color, tears are a path toward to be able to be read sympathetically, right? Which in a moment in which you're furious, that can be a valuable tool. And it's not that we're thinking about it, it's just sometimes that's how it comes out.
That's right. And I want to talk about the politics of tears, the politics, who gets to cry, who gets to be vulnerable, who gets to be angry. Reading your book made me think, no women really get to be angry in public, right? And yet, I wonder about the difference in cost that we can see.
So, this is so complicated, like teasing out the differences in how women's anger is received. Because I agree with you that actually there are costs pretty much for every kind of woman who gets angry. And not just about gender inequity, about racial inequality, about economic inequality, about women in the labor movement who were beaten. And, there are costs for all of these women, but they are expressed very differently. So, in many ways, the costs are highest for women of color who are caricatured angry black women. This is something you write about so beautifully in Eloquent Rage. I mean, this is and one of the things I tried to consider were the particular ideas attached to this cartoonish notion of what an angry black woman is. And I think in part, in ways that you've taught me, it has to do with women of color, and specifically black women's remove from white patriarchal power. Because they do not have access to patriarchal power, which men of many races do, and they do not have access to white supremacy, which white women do. And so they are cut off from the power structures. So the rage, as black women and women of color may express it, can be very easily marginalized in certain ways because it's not necessarily representative of a tremendous immediate threat to the power structure, because black women have been so successfully cut off from that power structure. And so black women's rage has been turned into a caricature, almost a comedic vision. I write in the book about how angry black women are used often by white women as expressors of rage that white women don't tend to, right?
These really, our favorite gifts, right? What is Waiting to Exhale, Angela Bassett.
Throwing the match on the car, right?
That's right.
And Maxine Waters looking over her glasses. And that white women deploy black women expressing their anger, and this is something other journalists have written about too, using black women to do the work of expressing the anger that white women are discouraged from expressing. The other thing that happens with black women's anger is that it is viewed as a threat. So you get this sort of monstrosity and militaristic view of an angry black woman as physically, violently threatening, and Michelle Obama, right?
Right, that New Yorker cover that tries to make a satire of it.
Right, it's trying to make the point that she has been militarized.
That's right.
Because the threat that she represented, and Michelle Obama, in that case, we talk about the ways that black women have been cut off from power. Here's where their anger becomes viewed as a violent threat and taken real seriously, is if they're going to live in the White House, right?
And you talk about Maxine Waters with this too, right? That she says this thing about how she's going to go and she's going to, take it to the president, take the president out, and she gets reframed as, she should be thrown in jail.
Right, and I would argue there, and she says, she's talking about this, like, look, I've been in, she says, well, how could you think that that's what I'm, that's what I'm calling for, know? But, and she points out, she's so good at, she calls out, I think it's Chris Cuomo who she has a conversation with and I report on in this book, where she says, you're just saying this because I'm a black woman and the idea that I have any right to critique the president feels in itself to be so wrong. She gives complete voice to this. Maxine Waters understands these dynamics and is always articulating them. Yeah. So, but I do think that one of the reasons that she is both used as the cartoon expression in those who support her, right? Yes. So she's useful to those who agree with her as the sort of meme, the gif, the looking over her glasses, reclaiming my time thing, and that's powerful. I don't want to take away, because she's also, that's a kind of power, is to be that communicative agent. But for those who are threatened by her, because they are, some of the anger on the right, a lot of the anger on the right, is fundamentally threatened by the idea of women, and particularly black women, gaining power or having the power to trouble the presidency of Donald Trump, or to disrupt an administration that is both super powerful and under siege by a mass of people who disapprove of it and do want to see him impeached. And so Maxine Waters, is both the sort of marginalized cartoon and the real threat. The thing about how white women's anger is discouraged is very different. Okay. Related. Yeah. White women benefit from, and thus in many ways uphold, white supremacy. They benefit from their associations with white men. They enjoy racial privilege, and therefore in many ways invest in that privilege. It is also true that because they are closer to that power, because they have more power, if their anger is turned on the white men, it poses to some degree, a more serious logistical threat to those white men.
That's right. That's right.
Right?
Yes.
And so the way that white women's anger is discouraged, it is very intense. It's actually, I don't think it's less intense than the way that black women's anger is. Yeah. It's just the mechanisms of its discouragement are different. A lot of it is about incentive for white women. It's the incentive to not be angry. Yes. So the ideals of white womanhood set by white men who depend on white women in some ways to defend their power and uphold it, to be appreciated by those white men, and not just admired, aesthetically, but to be the partners and associates and friends and get the jobs from and get the approval from and paid by the people who have the power. Those people incentivize a peaceful, affable white womanhood. And there you get all kinds of stereotypes about the crazy, you're irrational, you're childlike, you're ugly if you're angry. Yes. And those work to discourage white women. There's an incentive on offer for white women to not be angry, to be the cool girls, and that's I write in the book about the cool girl.
That's right.
Right.
And you talk about the part of the challenge of moving forward in this moment is this incentivizing of white women to sort of fall in line. Mm-hmm. And so my question, and you talk about them in part as the women of the sunken place, and which I love. And so what are we supposed to do in this moment where we're trying to have conversations about feminist solidarity? Is trust the thing we need? Because for many women of color, trusting white women precisely because of the sexiness and the seduction of these incentives makes it hard to figure out if they're going to be long-standing allies in the struggle.
Right, and I don't have an answer to that. That is a question that I too am posing. Yeah. And I don't have the answer, because we do have a history in which white women can be roused to powerful effect. Yeah. And this is a fundamental question of a coalition moving forward. If we do, as a sort of, in a country that is built around a minority rule in which white men have had a tremendous grip on social, sexual, economic, professional, political power, and everybody else who is not white and not a man has been in one way dehumanized, disenfranchised, disempowered, prevented from having equal participation in government and the economy, in sexual power. If that majority rose up together in coalition, it could topple the minority. That's the precarity of the American power structure, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's fundamentally about an oppressed majority.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of things in place to divide that majority against itself,
Yeah.
including offering these benefits, patriarchy to some, white supremacy to others, money and class status to others. I mean,
Yeah.
right? To make that majority natural enemies of each other.
Yeah.
And it works,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
And so the fundamental question is, do we need, if we want to move toward a progressive future where that white capitalist patriarchy is effectively challenged, does that happen because there's an extension of trust and like, okay, we can try to do this by communication, education, what Audre Lorde talked about, by using the anger between women as fundamentally generative toward a better coalition and stronger coalition in which we come to better understand the reasons for the resentments between women?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
Yeah.
That's one of the questions on the table. I don't have the answer. Or do we understand, and that I think supposes that the potential revolution could work. Because here's what happens, is that when it doesn't fully work, that segment that still has the power pushes the incentives again. Once it gets restabilized,
That's right.
it reimposes the incentives to certain people, to white women, to turn their back on the activism and coalition that they had perhaps awoken to and become educated about during their period of expressed anger and political and civic engagement.
Yeah.
And even if it's not those particular women, it'll be the next generation of women that they target and say, you know how to succeed within this system is rebuke the anger of your mothers and your grandmothers.
That's right. Kill them. Slay them.
Slay them.
That's right.
And then you'll get rewarded within this system. We'll give you the jobs, and we'll consider you we'll hold you up as the ideal.
HDTV homes and all.
Yes, yes.
all of the things.
And
right?
so this is one of the key messages, and we see this, right? We see this. There are moments of coalition. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's not fraught with inequity and real reasons for women within that coalition to be angry at each other.
Yeah.
But sometimes when it does work together, it has been historically very powerful. But then it has receded again. It's one of the reasons that I'm keenly aware of the fact that I'm a white woman expressing anything like optimism about this moment, and therefore I am.
Thank you for being one.
Well, no, but
look, it's important for us to say to our allies, right, that you're helping. If we're telling white women get your people, this book you do a lot of getting your people.
Well, thank you. That was part of. I really recognized one of the reasons I wrote this book and wrote as I did about race and about white women. And it is meant, by the way, to address other white women. Yep. I am a white woman, right? And with my white woman politics, it is meant as a fulsome and I hope welcoming and generous approach to the many white women who have been awakened and who I want to understand is crucially important to the future.
Yeah.
But it's also an attempt to talk honestly about where white women's activism and anger has had blind spots in the past that in fact have been fundamentally perilous or fatal to the coalitions that might have helped us achieve more in the past. And I am deeply cautiously optimistic that one of the things we're going through right now is a mass civic education about the interconnectedness of oppressions.
Yes.
And we've had, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in the 80s. For a while it was sort of understood as this academic jargon that didn't really mean it. We're now, like last year, I think Ashley Judd said it on the Oscar stage. Okay, that's not going to solve the problem, but like that,
it's a big deal.
It matters that we are, that people are thinking more about this, that we are having, it is an illustration of what Audre Lorde suggested might happen, the kind of, Linda Sarsour says in the book, talking about the arguments that happen in advance of the Women's March, contentious dialogue is by design. We got to air some of this stuff in order to get stronger and move forward perhaps in cooperation and coalition.
Yeah.
We can't just pretend that these internal and internecine angers and resentments and inequities don't exist.
That's right.
And so that's what this book is written toward, is encouraging a moment of conversation, even when it's uncomfortable, even when some of the anger is directed at us.
Right.
And to say, no, we need to do this to get to the place we all want to go, we hope.
You know, so this reminds me, so many great points here. So one of the things, so we've been watching the Christine Blasey Ford, you know, her challenging Brett Kavanaugh's position, you know, opportunity to go to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that I found myself thinking as I watched her testimony is, I have never, as a black woman, wanted so badly in my life for white women's tears to actually do good work, right? But the thing I'm thinking about is, but that is the murkiness of the politics of solidarity, that all of us have to make these choices about how the things that make us uncomfortable can also, if used properly, do good work in the world, right?
This is one of the hardest things to describe about the moment that we're having now.
Yeah.
Because Christine Blasey Ford, to my mind, is the third example of a trend that is fundamental to, I think, the expression of mass rage around gendered and racial and class inequalities that we are engaging in right now. I believe that it matters that it was Hillary Clinton who was defeated in 2016, because one of the ways that rage about, for example, gender inequality and racist inequality, one of the ways that anger about those issues is suppressed is by telling people, you don't have anything to be angry about anymore. And of course that happened around race with, like, Barack Obama's the president.
That's
Come
right.
on, we're over it. We're
That's
post-race.
That's right.
And of course that was also fundamental to the ways that Hillary Clinton was regarded on both right and left. Like, she has all the power. She's won at white patriarchy. And by the way, she had won within a system. That's part of why she was a compromise candidate. But there was no other approach, right? To be outside that system was to be Shirley Chisholm or Pat Schroeder, who couldn't raise the money, who didn't have the support of their party. In order to become the first woman major party presidential candidate, you actually had to find, it was always going to be a woman who could rise within the system that was built around whiteness and patriarchal power. And so this is the first woman. That's how you got to have the candidate. But then once she was within that system, she had ceded her identity as being outside of that system, which made it, so anybody who wanted to be angry about sexism or, found a hard target in terms of Clinton, because it was like, right, but she has all the power. She's inevitable. We were told over and over again, she was inevitable. This was always a crazy locution. There is no way that any woman is inevitably the president in a country that has never even nominated one before, right? Because that's just not, it was an afactual statement always. But that's what we were told.
Yes.
And that's what many people absorbed as the reality. She didn't need rage on her behalf. If anything, we should feel rage at her because of the variety of ways in which she was flawed.
She was compromised,
right?
That's right.
But then when the vision of this super powerful woman who had won the game of white patriarchy was nonetheless, and however you felt about her, this super competent, smart, capable politician, never anybody better qualified, was beaten by a racist toddler. It was like a movie about 80s boardroom, like, brought to life. It was like 9 to 5. It was like, oh, wait, that still exists. That can still happen, that the inarguably more qualified person can not get the job because she is leapfrogged over by an incompetent man. Okay, so that was part of what made it visible.
Yes.
The next, a year later, we have been having an ongoing conversation for decades about sexual harassment and assault. It mattered that it was wealthy, white, famous, cisgendered actresses who were some of the first to raise their voices and talk about what they'd suffered at the hands of Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
And this is not to take anything away from their story in any way.
Yeah.
But again, it's about that proximal power that some women have, very often white women, wealthy women, have to a white patriarchy that can get their stories recognized as human and also serve as the shock. Like, oh, if it can happen to them, then sexism, sexual assault must be real. If it can take a toll on their careers, then that thing that happened to me at my cubicle or on the factory floor, then that might also be sexism, even though everything's telling me like that doesn't exist anymore. We're post sexism. We fixed it all.
That's right.
Christine Blasey Ford is the third, and I thought a lot watching her, and I can't tell you how much I admired her testimony. And it was I wept when she started speaking because I realized I hadn't heard this woman's voice yet, and here it was. I also thought a lot, having read a lot about Anita Hill's testimony and her describing how the all-white, all-male Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 had trouble actually recognizing her, comprehending her, because they couldn't match up her credentials as an Ivy-educated lawyer with the fact that she was detached from these institutions that made black women comprehensible to them, made women comprehensible, marriage, she was an unmarried woman, and patronage. An African-American woman who was also a peer of a Supreme Court nominee made her fundamentally incomprehensible. Christine Blasey Ford, by contrast, was comprehensible from nearly every direction, as she's a white, married, middle-aged, credentialed woman who was quiet, deferential, polite, and rational, and never raised her voice in anger. And I thought a lot about that, and it even goes beyond Anita Hill, because it matters that both of those women were credentialed, right? What about the woman who's not, who's not a doctor, who's not a lawyer, who's not a powerful peer of a Supreme Court nominee, but has nonetheless suffered harassment or assault at his hands? If we can't believe these two women, where do we even begin to start with the millions of women who would never be able to testify in front of that Senate Judiciary Committee because their stories would be even less believed than these two women?
That's right. That's right. I mean, she perfectly performs white femininity and yet is responded to with all of these men sort of yelling. But before we talk about that, I also, this triad that you've mapped, I think is really brilliant. I would add that Heather Heyer probably matters in the triad.
That's a very powerful point.
Yes. And I would also add that part of what you've mapped is that in every arena then, in the state, in professional life, in personal life, and in the streets, every single sphere in which women would move, that there has been this backlash and suppression of their anger and the harm, right? And so that is a coup that should shock us. I mean, it feels devastating to me that if white women can't be in public life, private life, professional life, or in protest, then what are we to do?
This is the question that is posed, and this is also the question you asked about: is coalition possible, and what are the strategic trade-offs that you need to make? On the one hand, we can look at this four examples that you raise, and say, are we angry that it has to be white women before we take these stories seriously, or I think it's and. Do we also acknowledge that we need to wake the white women, and if this is if their power, their proximal power, can be useful in revealing the degree to which women are still oppressed, then in fact, is this strategically necessary? And this goes back to the question, do we need white women?
That's a hard question. I don't, okay. I'm not going to touch that.
But this is an electoral question. No, it's an electoral question that every candidate needs to ask.
Here's the thing, right? I think that part of what we need to say is that there is no feminist struggle in this country without white women. That's a hard truth for women of color to accept. But it should be a mandate for white women, right?
It should be a compulsion for white women, and that's one of the points that I'm trying to make. And it is not, I want to be clear, this is also not just about feminism. Look at the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
Right? This is the story of Selma, in part, is a story of how coverage changes when you have white women, white people going down in solidarity. Now that is also, like all of this that we're talking about, is it enormously frustrating and itself symptomatic of the inequities?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
But like this is part of the story. This is why, in fact, part of what I'm writing about is a majority, is a potential coalition. Because if we are fractured, we don't get anything done. But that's not meant to be something as easy as a call to like easy coalition, because it's not that either.
Absolutely. One of the things that you and I have talked about, though, is that when there are these uprisings, are a real threat that comes from white women, that we can expect an uptick in male violence. And so when we watch the reaction to Christine Blasey Ford, which I think many people will be recovering from for a long time, particularly survivors, our congressmen were just yelling. They were just yelling on television, like an unbridled show of rage. And so part of the argument that I take from your book is that women's anger is a public good. And I wonder if the corollary to that is that in most cases, men's anger has been a public bad, a public harm, has done more harm than good. And the reason I'm asking is because I'm wondering about, surely women's rage and anger is going to be met with male fury.
Right. So, well, that's one of the punishments amongst the many censures on women's anger and the things that they risk.
Yeah.
And this is part of why my book is not prescriptive and just telling people, like, go on, get angry, get mad, right? Because there are costs that are incurred. It is, you might not get that promotion. You might get that reputation at your office for being difficult and you never get hired somewhere else.
Yeah.
You might, if you are a woman of color who gets mad because she is pulled over for no reason, get incarcerated or shot because you dare to be angry at the policeman. You might, if you are a high school girl who turns down a boy, be met with violence, which is one of the biggest parts of the trend in terms of gun violence, you know.
Yes.
Part of what we are hearing, part of the stories that should be coming through loud and clear, the stories of the incels, the men who are angry that women are empowered enough to even reject them sexually. Forget about whether they're those women are expressing a political anger. That they are independent enough of a patriarchal power structure that they can turn down a date, turn down sex with a man, and that those men feel so entitled to that sexual availability and power over women that their anger in response to rejection is to run over people on the street with cars and shoot them with guns, right? So this is not a book that suggests that women should just go out and rage and not, it's a book that seeks to identify the many costs. And yes, that anger I hadn't thought of it in the way you posed it as like, is women's anger has it done more good than harm versus men's? I think that the way that I saw it is that there's so much connection between some of the righteous anger that men have given voice to, but that is, if it's been given voice to by white men, has been acknowledged as righteous, as fundamentally patriotic. It's the anger of our founding, versus very similarly voiced anger about inequity. So much of the anger that I write about historically takes as its cue the Declaration of Independence, the rhetoric of our revolution. And that starts with Mum Bet, the enslaved woman in Massachusetts, who hears in the 18th century the rhetoric of revolution in her home, applies it to her own situation, and says, wait a minute, if you're talking about liberty, this doesn't, I'm going to talk about liberty too. She petitions for her freedom. Her case actually is so consequential, which is one of my arguments, that women's anger actually has legal consequence, political consequence, but we're discouraged from seeing it. Her case becomes one of the cases that leads to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. The Declaration of Sentiments, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848, is a riff on the Declaration of Independence. The strikers in the Lowell Mills in the 1830s, young women, some of the first iterations of the labor movement, are using the language like our forefathers resisted the British government, so are we resisting. And yet that anger hasn't been admired or revered or taken as seriously. When we talk about the 2016 election, the political media, the broad mainstream media, is constantly chiding Hillary Clinton in particular for not, and Democrats, for not having taken seriously enough the anger of a white working class. And yet they're not chided for not taking seriously enough the anger of a black working class, which was incidentally very much on the side of the Clinton campaign. They're not taking seriously enough the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, they were treated as disruptive for having interrupted both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders events. They were, Black Lives Matter activists were treated as like, you're not good for the cause here because you're complicating this narrative.
That's right.
We're not schooled to like train our attention on that anger and understand it as fundamentally diagnostic. And what are we to learn about what are you angry about that needs to be addressed by our politics and our candidates?
That's right.
And so to me it's not whose anger has been to the good or to the ill. I think it's whose anger has been treated seriously and accorded power.
Right.
And in having so much power, it is probably true that white men's anger has been more destructive because it has helped bolster the power that they have that has then been used to fundamentally subjugate other kinds of people.
And part of the thing I'm thinking is that these are grounds for solidarity, right? That the way that men use power, they get mad when it is being taken away, and they often come home and they take it out on the people who live there, or the way that they seek power. There is you talk, for instance, again about these incentives, and I'm thinking, it's not just white women who have an incentives problem, right? Black women also want to curry the favor of men, have been staunch defenders of Bill Cosby, of R. Kelly, right? And so there seem to be there are reasons for us to get this right, and there are actual ways that the patriarchal analysis does cross racial boundaries in ways that can bring women together. And part of it seems to be about a real confrontation with harm. The reason that I wanted you to drill down to the problem of male anger and male violence is because in the end, we're talking about life or death matters. Women being killed, women being raped, women being suppressed in terms of their possibility, right?
Women, forced birth. That's what we're talking. That's what's on the table, right?
That's what's on the table.
Right.
Yeah.
It's actual women's bodies.
Yeah.
That are, it's not just about their power. We can't, when we talk about black men's bodies are also on the line. That's life and death, right? When we're talking about white men, we're so rarely talking about their bodies being at risk. And that's one of the questions. It was Kamala Harris who asked Brett Kavanaugh, right? Like, can you think of any laws on the books that fundamentally determine men's ability to exert control and autonomy over their own bodies?
Yeah.
But that is, and it's as you point out, it's not just abortion. It is abortion. It is rape. It's sexual incursion. It's domestic abuse, violence, incarceration. That is what is at stake for women, and among the forces that are used to encourage their affability and non-defiance.
Right. So what do we do, though? Because one of the challenges, you use Kate Mann's term empathy, which is getting rightfully a lot of play in this moment. What do we do with the fact that there's a way that we're talking about all this violence and all this harm, but you write in the book about the moments when suddenly colleagues were emailing you in the midst of the Me Too moment for absolution, for feminist absolution, you call it, and that your heart really went out to them, right? And I'm thinking about men that I know who I know have done forms of harm, men that I love and care about. What do you do with the empathy problem?
Well, we have to sit with it. We have to think about it, and we have to address the complexity. There's no easy answer to it. There's an incredible passage that I quote in the book, Judith Levine, who says you can't unknow. After these moments in which one of the structural problems around raising a mass women's movement that addresses gender inequality comes from the fact that because women are an oppressed majority, every woman has men in her life. And every man has women in his life, right? And we are in each other's lives. We are dependent on each other, both emotionally and economically. We are in intimate, familial, romantic, sexual connection with each other. And asking of women to object to and dissent over a gendered power imbalance on some level is asking us to identify as our oppressors the men we love and need. And that is an incredibly hard ask. That is why it only happens like every 50 years, because there are so many personal, individual, emotional, and economic incentives in place to just let it keep going.
Yeah.
And so what do we do with the very real problem that in pointing toward bad guys, we are very often looking straight at our good guys?
Yeah.
What do we do with that? It's just reality. You can't change it. They're the men we love. And so I think we have to work toward, as we do around the anger of women at each other within a movement, we have to work toward the expression of complicated feeling, that it doesn't come down to just defense or vilification, that it comes down to, look, I need to be able to make this clear to you, that I can simultaneously love you and not only hate something that you have done, but politically object to it as wrong.
Yeah.
And that those things can coexist. And of course, this takes on 15 million variations depending on the relationship and the harm and the...
Yeah.
But that's something we all have to exercise our brains about doing. And the other part is acknowledging that when we have these moments where the rules fundamentally change, where we actually do challenge a power structure, where a lot of abuse has occurred, some relationships will not recover.
Yeah.
And there are women who speak to me in this book about how marriages are falling apart because they entered a marriage, you know, with a woman who is not necessarily politicized, not expressing her anger, and then suddenly this is her life, whether it's involved in the teacher strikes, that's one of the women that I spoke to, or just driven by a fury post-2016, and husbands are saying, like, wait, you're not who I married, and relationships are falling apart. That's one of the things that happened in the 1970s when we changed our ideas about what the landscape of women's lives might be professionally and economically and sexually, and marriages changed and there was a big divorce spike. And we have to acknowledge that some of this remaking comes with deep emotional costs. But that we can't just change the game and change the rules. If we want to alter who has power and who doesn't, and who has the ability to abuse it and who doesn't, we actually can't do it without there being costs and without there being damage.
Yeah.
We can't just look at a new generation of babies and say, you guys, it's going to be new rules for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, and part of that is that we care, there's a gendered component to that we care more about doing damage to men than we care about what it means to give justice to women, right? It feels like, that is what it felt like when we watched the senators responding to Christine Blasey Ford, that it became a conversation less about the harm that she had experienced and more about the harm that he would experience.
Right, and interestingly, it was presented from the start. Chuck Grassley framed it that way. He said both of these people have suffered. And I immediately heard in that the sort of old canard about, like, it's as bad to be called a racist as it is to suffer racism. It's as bad to be called a misogynist as it is to be the victim of misogyny.
Or Trump.
Right.
You know, there are bad people on both sides.
Right, exactly. And all the language we heard around Me Too, it's a witch hunt, and all the empathy stuff that Kate Mann writes about, and that we're talking, because we fundamentally see powerful men as our fullest humans because they've been the ones who've been given the most imaginative exploration in our minds, and they've been our leaders. They've been the people who've been offered the full range of rhetorical expression, who can be angry and who can cry and who can be righteously furious on their own behalf. So many other people who are not powerful white men have been limited in the ways they've been able to express themselves, and so there are all kinds of ways in which our sympathy and our recognition of these men as human, our recognition of the jobs they do and the role they play in their families is so fully imagined that we can very quickly imagine the harm that's done to them, whereas so many of the women whose lives we really don't know that much about, who haven't been our leaders and our talk show hosts and our morning show hosts, and who don't come into, because they've been barred from those kinds of positions, and from being those interlocutors of American experience.
Right.
So many of those women, they don't really exist in our imaginations, and so we're not thinking like, oh, those women who were harassed by Charlie Rose or Matt Lauer, or, they're just anonymous. They don't exist. That's part of the costs of having been kept from power.
Yeah. But I'm also thinking, you make this really brilliant point about how Me Too, the hashtag Me Too movement, as distinct from Tarana Burke's, brings in the professional in a way, that it isn't, so you're writing about anti-feminists who are sort of saying, what about all these men who will be affected? This is just about sex and flirtation gone wrong. And you say, no, 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 this is about the professional. Yes. And I'm also struck, though, by the distinction of this moment is that in the 70s, we heard the personal is political. Now, Christine Blasey Ford is asking us, as a matter of public concern, to take something that was personal. It didn't happen in a professional space. It happened when she was a child. And to hold that as being a matter of public concern. And so what do we do? And this is the connection to Tarana Burke's Me Too, was that it was about interpersonal violence. It wasn't about professional violence.
Right. It was about sexual violence, sexual harm done.
So what do we do? Because we seem a bit more comfortable, oddly, with the professional conversation than we seem with the personal conversation.
Well, interestingly, one of the things that happened during the professional chapter of this, which is ongoing, right, we should say, but during the hashtag Me Too movement, that I argued at the time, often included stories of women who had sustained sexualized harm, but was also about stories of professional harm, discrimination.
Yes.
Lots of people kept trying to reframe that as entirely about sexual harm in order to make an argument that we were conflating degrees, that we were category collapse, so that the violent rapes alleged to have been committed by Harvey Weinstein were the same as like Al Franken having grabbed somebody's butt, right? And there was, in arguing against what was going on in the hashtag Me Too movement, people tried very quickly to move it to terms of personal harm and intimacy, right?
Yes.
And I think there's a reason for that, right?
Yes, okay.
Because, and I think it probably has to do with the fact that private and emotional spheres are still coded as female, and therefore the harm sustained within them is still taken less seriously.
Yes.
Like there's a way in which a professional sphere and power relations within it, because it's been coded male and public, like if you're talking about power inequities, it's like, right, this is a serious complaint, right?
Yes.
But if we're talking about what happens in a bedroom, well then who can say, right? Because it's very personal, and that is one of the great struggles of a women's movement, is to have the truly personal, the intimate, often the sexual or the romantic, taken seriously as a political inequity.
Yes.
And so I think that in moving conversations to the sexual sphere, where there can always be the like, things are complicated, right? And we've seen that around Jan Ghomeshi, John Hockenberry, misreading Lolita. There's like a lot of the men who have come out and written about how they were the victims in the style of Brett Kavanaugh. There is a way of saying this was the private sphere, this is romance, I like beer. Like this has nothing to do with politics, public life, professional life, economic life. This is kids, sex, eros, beer. Like there is, it's trying to wall it off from an area of valid mass social and political critique. And one of the things that is fascinating about what's happening is that I think women are resisting that.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial that, you know, Tarana Burke's movement, Tarana Burke has been a crucial leader throughout the hashtag Me Too movement, even as what her original fight was distinct from what Me Too came to encompass.
Yes.
And I think it's crucial that she has been a leader around the Christine Blasey Ford allegations.
Yes.
Because we're insisting, many of us, on saying, actually, this conversation is both about, it's both and how they're connected.
Yeah.
It is about how personal behavior can be criminal behavior that is professionally disqualifying.
Yeah.
It is about how professional power, legal power, like sitting on the Supreme Court, has the ability, is part of a mechanism that then has the ability to govern the circumstances of women's private lives, to determine whether or not they have access to birth control and abortion, that is fundamental to how they will conduct those sex lives that we're told have nothing to do with the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Right? And in having this very difficult, painful, horrifying conversation, part of what is happening is that women are insisting on making these connections visible. Going back to that phrase, the personal is political, and the political has everything to do with determining for personal possibility.
That's right. That's right. So one of the things I love about this book is that you outline so critically what women's rage has built and can build. Because the narrative is always, you're destroying everything. And so you resituate us and help us to think about the things that have become possible because of women's rage. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, a lot of that, I have to say, a lot of that comes out of your book. I didn't steal from your book. But the beauty, part of the beauty of your book, which was published, and I got to read an early copy, and it was just before I started writing my book. And part of what was so thrilling, I mean, like, I felt reading you like electric and like bubbly, okay? Because part of what you were doing that was radical and crucial and urgent was making clear that an expression of rage can be joyful. You write about that directly. Can be a release, can push us forward, is not just, there's this view in which rage, particularly rage coming from women, is all about destruction and, you know, and a lot of it is critique and trying to disrupt power structures, but that the letting out can take us to a new place. That for you, learning to embrace rage as a Black feminist was about coming into yourself in a way that was powerful, that produced power and change. Yeah. And that spirit undergirded my very quick writing of my book, which was like, right, this is a book that is not about destruction. It is about how rage has helped us transform this country to get closer to being what some of us feel its unfulfilled promise might someday be. And that the improvements that have been made in this country have come in part through social and political movements that were catalyzed in large part by angry women who were willing to yell and yell with each other and sometimes yell at each other, by the way, very often, right? And that's not to say that women's rage is always righteous. It's not, because women are often asked to do the work of protecting that white capitalist patriarchy, and they do, you know, as foot soldiers against the integration of schools. Phyllis Schlafly harnessing the power of white women discomfited by the second wave movement and defeating the ERA. I'm not suggesting that all of women's rage is progressive, but the progressive movements that I think we have come to understand as having fundamentally improved our nation stem from, in many cases, rage that was voiced by women whose names we never learned.
I'm thinking about Stormé
DeLarvier, who was, and this is, I understood, and I knew a little bit about the Stonewall. I had read about the LGBT movement, you know, and I knew about Stonewall, and I knew that it was slightly more complicated than that it was white cisgendered men who led the gay rights movement, which is often the pop view of it. I knew about Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. And then when I started to read more about the actual night of the Stonewall insurrection, and it's very cloudy because everybody has different memories, right? So none of this is written into stone. But most recollections, many recollections, are of the person, sort of one of the people inciting the insurrection is a lesbian woman of color, a singer, a performer, later a bouncer, Stormé DeLarvier, who objects to being arrested by police. In some accounts, she fights them off. In some accounts, she gets out of the paddy wagon on the other side when they put her in. And in many accounts, she turns to a crowd outside the Stonewall Inn in 1969 and says, "Why don't you guys do something?" And it might be her words of asking, like, we're so angry, why don't we change this? That may or may not, but may well have precipitated the throwing of pennies and the charging of that bar that became a series of nights of insurrection at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village that was the catalytic event, lit a match under the gay rights movement. But that history, hers along with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, two drag performers, perhaps female-identified men of color, those stories, we don't think of the gay rights movement. When there was a big Hollywood movie called Stonewall a few years ago, and the protagonist was like a white cisgendered man from the Midwest who came and like threw a rock and said gay rights, or, you know, and
Yeah.
We just see, in the process of looking at our history, there are two things you have to root out.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take away from the men who were instrumental in all these movements too. But when we look back at these social movements, abolition, suffrage, labor, which often gets written about as a white man's movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, it takes one lens to like find the women, right? Because they're often there right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then you have to have your second lens, which is to find the anger.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those women, their anger was obscured, and that's the Rosa Parks story, right? That she's presented as demure, stoic, exhausted, but in fact was a furious and dedicated lifelong organizer, against racial violence.
Yes.
So you have to do both of those things simultaneously in order to get a kind of picture of this country and how it's been made better in part by angry women.
I couldn't think of a better place to stop. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Rebecca.
Thank
and
you.
I hope that folks will go out and get Good and Mad. It's a great read.
Thank you so much, Brittney.
Yes, my pleasure.